This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, are you ready? It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. When you can make faster decisions, there's no telling what you'll create. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Hello, this is Justin Beyer for Software Engineering Radio, and today I'm speaking with Adam Shostack. Adam's a leading expert on threat modeling and a consultant, entrepreneur, technologist, author, and game designer. He's a member of the Black Hat Review Board and helped create the CVE and many other things. He currently helps many organizations improve their security via Shostack and Associates, and advises startups, including as a Mach 37 star mentor. While at Microsoft, he drove the auto run fix into Windows Update, was the lead designer of the SDL threat modeling tool version 3, and created the Elevation of Privilege game. Adam is the author of Threat Modeling, Designing for Security, and the co-author of the New School of Information of Security. Hi, Adam, and welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here.
So, Adam, just to start off the show, before we delve into what threat modeling is, can you define what a threat is in this context?
Sure. The definition of threat that I like to use is it's a promise of future harm, right? I'm going to hit you. I'm going to attack your system. And so a threat is something that might happen. And oftentimes a threat is accompanied by a condition that you can avoid the threat. I'm going to hit you if you don't give me your lunch money.
Okay, so essentially the threat is almost the impending doom, and there's a likelihood that it's going to happen at some point, and there's some negative consequence as a result of that.
And, importantly, something you can do to avoid it.
Okay, so I can implement mitigations. So is that where threat modeling fits in?
Exactly.
Okay, so when we discuss that, what is threat modeling overall? What's the goal of it, and what is it doing to achieve those?
If you build something without thinking about security, your security team might show up and say, oh my gosh, you've got all these problems, we can't ship. And that's an awful situation for everyone. You're annoyed, you were planning to ship these awesome new features. Security is annoyed, they didn't have a chance to influence the design. Threat modeling is a way for security and engineering to collaborate and think through the threats that are going to apply to the system, ideally before you've written a line of code.
Okay, so the idea is essentially catch the threats before they happen, have a plan to solve the threats before they happen, and try to avoid the threats happening when you actually ship the product to customers.
Exactly.
So why would we want to do that instead of applying the threat modeling after we've already built the product? What's the downside to doing it at the end?
Well, the downside to doing it at the end is, as I'm sure your listeners know, the cheapest time to make changes to code is before the code is written. The easiest way to fix a bug is to not introduce the bug or to catch it super early. The later you are making changes to the code, the more expensive they become. There are dependencies on the way things are happening. And so every change has repercussions, it has knock-on effects, it has ripple effects. And so doing this work early gives you insight into how to avoid that rework. But I do want to talk about one time when it makes sense to do it late, right? After an acquisition. If you're starting out today, it can make sense to do a threat model of what you've already built, because you've got to start somewhere. You can also start by threat modeling just the new features and thinking about some security debt, realizing that you're going to have to come back, take a look at the big picture, but you can start small if you're starting today, and you should.
Okay, so essentially, you don't want to have to do it at the end, but if you're forced because you're acquiring a new product, you've never had it before, and the previous company's never done a threat model, it's better to have something rather than nothing, because then at least you have a plan that you can start working on to fix the product.
Yes.
Fantastic. So then just kind of changing direction a little bit, I know you've kind of covered this, but I just want to explicitly discuss, how does threat modeling actually benefit my overall organization or the projects that I'm working on?
So, the first way it benefits your organization is by giving you a structured, systematic, and comprehensive approach to security. If we're going to create a model of the entire thing that we're shipping, it gives us an opportunity to do analysis of the whole, right? So we can be systematic. We can be structured using techniques, and we'll talk about these in a little bit. I think stride or a kill chain to think through what's going on. A lot of people, when they start out with threat modeling, will just ask, what can go wrong? We can put some structure on that. And by applying a structure to a model of the system as a whole, we can get to assurance that we're actually being comprehensive. So at a technical level, we have this assurance that what we're doing is structured, systematic, and comprehensive. Then at an organizational level, the benefit that we get is collaboration instead of conflict between teams. And that is a super important benefit that we often overlook, that this conflict exists because, look, if you're not threat modeling, and I, as an engineer, come to my security team and I say, so what should I do to secure the thing that we're building? I'm going to get advice like software composition analysis and static analysis and penetration testing and fuzzing, all of which are great techniques to use, and all of which happen later in the design and development of the product, all of which happen later in the design and development of the process. Security doesn't have a seat at the table. And so design choices that you're making get encoded. They get encoded in the APIs, they get encoded in the distribution of components, and they become hard to change. So threat modeling diffuses conflict, which is a massive organizational benefit.
Okay, so by having a structured process, we ensure consistency and that we're covering all the things that we should be covering. Whereas these technical processes like static analysis or fuzzing are going to miss things. And by also doing this at an organizational level early on as a collaborative effort, we're able to work as a security and a development group and resolve the issues before we build that issue with the model or a threat into the product that then is built in and is very expensive to change after the fact. So, knowing all of that, is there any benefit on the compliance side? So, if I'm building a product that has to be HIPAA compliant or it has to be PCI compliant or any other number of standards, how does threat modeling help on that front? Is there something that I can then produce to my customers and say, hey, look, my product is compliant and here's how we achieve the compliance?
The largest compliance benefit that you get from threat modeling isn't always customer visible. A lot of compliance requirements are difficult for engineers to understand. Why do I have to do all of this stuff? The reason you do that stuff is because there are threats to the system. A lot of systems to which you need to comply jump over the threat step. There's an implicit threat model and say, here's a control, here's a control, here's a control. When you go through the threat modeling process, you do two things. One, you make explicit the reason for the control, and you can make a decision about, is the control in the compliance guide the best control, or is there an alternative control that makes more sense? And oftentimes you end up with less work and a more secure system, because instead of applying controls where there's no threat, but it might be a threat to another version of the system or an implicit idea that if you implemented it this way, you'd need this control. And let me be explicit here rather than really modeling and meta modeling. A lot of compliance guidance says you need antivirus software. The antivirus software is there to prevent malicious software from getting onto the system. With today's DevOps world, we often do things like immutable builds or Phoenix builds. Those also control the threat of malware getting onto the system, because if it's an immutable build, the malware can't write itself to disk. At that point, you're addressing the concern you're addressing the need that the anti-malware requirement addresses. And you can make a solid case that this control I'm putting in place, while it's not the one listed in the standard, is an effective mitigation of the threat, and therefore we are compliant and you are compliant, and we get these other benefits from the architecture. And so compliance can get a massive win from thinking through the threats that are present and addressing them more rationally.
Okay, so the antivirus solution essentially isn't necessary because of how I'm implementing it, and my threat model would detect that that control is no longer necessary. Almost as if I'm using Docker containers to deploy on my software, and my Docker containers are destroyed every 30 minutes. Why do I need to put antivirus on there? Because no files will ever persist for more than 30 minutes. So the likelihood that malware is going to execute in that time is slim to none.
Mm-hmm. And even if it does execute, it's gone in 15 minutes on average.
Exactly. So essentially, by having the threat model, I can then say to the compliance people, yeah, I know the standard says you want me to have antivirus on every single server that gets stood up or every single application server that's running, but there's no need. And here's why. And here's our threat model that says this doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of shifting gears just a little bit, what kinds of projects benefit from threat modeling? Is there like a certain size, a certain type? Like if I'm building a software as a service, a cloud-based application, an AI, machine learning, blockchain system, which ones benefit?
I think the ones that include technology.
So pretty much every application should benefit from some level of threat modeling.
Indeed. And some threat modeling has been done, right? Your blockchain projects tend to have a threat model either explicitly or implicitly with them that tell you, hey, if you're implementing a blockchain thing, you need to worry about the security of the client, because if I can break in, steal your private keys, I'm stealing real money, right? And so some of these threats have been worked through. Similarly with machine learning, Microsoft has published a guide to threat modeling with machine learning. There's a group called the Berryville Institute of Machine Learning that's also published a threat model guide, where a lot of the analysis has been done relative to an abstracted system. And that means that if I'm building a system that involves machine learning, I can start by reading through one or the other, or even both of these guides, and saying, how does this threat apply to the system I'm working on? And for a lot of systems, that will be sufficient. Now, maybe what you're doing is threat modeling to identify cats in pictures on the internet. And the downside to that system misidentifying a mug of tea as a cat are pretty low. Or maybe what you're doing is you're doing machine learning in the news right now to decide whether or not people will be taken aside for additional screening at the airports. I would hope in that second situation, where the impact of a bad decision is higher, they're going to do more extensive threat modeling.
Exactly. We had done a previous episode on some machine learning security. And as you kind of mentioned, that whole, based on what you're modeling, your threat model needs to be kicked up a notch depending on the negative impacts of using that. But just to circle back a little bit, you said implicit versus an explicit threat model. Can you just define those?
Sure. An explicit threat model is one where you have written down what you've done and why you've done it. And in fact, maybe this is a good time for me to step back and talk about the structure of threat modeling a little bit and say, I believe that threat modeling involves answering 4 key questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? So what are we working on? Do we have an explicit written scope for our threat model? What can go wrong? Have we written down the answers? And importantly, how we got to the answers? What are we going to do about it? What mitigations are we going to put in place? What risks are we accepting and why? And then did we do a good job? Retrospect, analyze what we did. Say, did we get about the right number of threats out of this? Do people feel that the process was effective? And so the explicit threat model is the answers to those questions. The implicit model is someone was told to go think about it. They did, and they said, "Yeah, we're good." Or, "No, I think we need to address these 4 threats." How did you get to those 4 threats? Well, they're important threats. I thought about the system, and this is what's come out.
So almost the explicit is we went through an exercise. We almost ran a project and created a project and said, here's our scope. This is the questions we need answered at the end of this project. This is our written report that needs to come out of this. And this is the feedback that we're going to circle back for the next time we have to do this. Whereas the implicit is almost, I read the OWASP top 10 and we have a web app and we do SQL. So SQL injection is important. Make sure we don't have SQL injections on our web page.
Yes, and you make it sound so waterfall-y. Let me talk about this in the agile world, because I think that's important for a great many people working today. If I have a big diagram on my wall of what we're working on, and I go up to it and I say, let's pretend we're working on a system like iTunes. I'm going to update the recommendation engine. I've done a spike. I've tested the new recommendation engine. I believe we can put it in. And my goal for this next 2 weeks is to get that recommendation into production. There's no new data flows. Nothing is changing the way it crosses a trust boundary. So I don't think there are any threats relative to this work. That's an explicit bit of threat modeling done with the team. It doesn't produce a written report, as you said. Someone else comes up and says, this week I'm adding support for artists to upload WAV files as a new form that we're going to ship music in. Okay, so I've got a new file type. It's coming from, we bound who can be an artist on iTunes, but it's a pretty low bar, so we assume that attackers will use this. So I'm really going to worry about the parser here. I'm going to worry about elevation of privilege threats that come with those files. And in fact, this entire 2 weeks, I'm going to work through the best secure design of the parser because we know that this is problematic. And out of what I just said, we get some Kanban board items, we get some written analysis records, because the very simple act of saying, what are we working on? A new path for files to come in from the outside, produced awareness that threats could accompany those files, and therefore we needed to do deeper analysis. So we can be very agile in doing this while still being explicit and lightweight for the things that are appropriately lightweight, and more in-depth where we need to be.
Okay, so I actually want to touch a little more on how we can take and track threats as a result of our threat modeling process in the agile overall software development and even waterfall, and touch on that a little bit later. But I want to circle a little earlier back in your explanation. Can we talk about what a data flow and what a trust boundary are?
Sure. So one way to threat model is to use data flow diagrams to answer the question of what can go wrong. And data flow diagrams, DFDs, are commonly associated with threat modeling because threats tend to follow the data flows. A data flow diagram is a really simple way of expressing what we're working on. It has roughly 5 components. It has processes, which are all running code. It has data flows. It has data stores. It has external actors, and it has trust boundaries. And trust boundaries are the unusual piece here. They're what you don't usually draw on the whiteboard. And a trust boundary is anywhere different principles interact, anywhere entities that have different permissions, different rights, different authority interact on opposite sides of a trust boundary. And so we make those explicit. We draw them as dotted lines.
So let's delve a little more into the trust boundary subject, though.
Okay.
So we're kind of discussing there's external actors and you're drawing these trust boundaries. And what does that really mean? Is that, on one half it's untrusted, the other half it's trusted, kind of like a firewall? Is it a little more ephemeral or vague?
It's not vague. A trust boundary needs to exist and it needs to be enforced. A firewall is a great way to enforce a trust boundary. So are user IDs. If I have a traditional Linux system that has root and it has Adam and it has Justin and it has Alice as users on the system, I can't read your files, you can't read Alice's unless she's chmoded them. So there's a trust boundary that exists between us, and there's an enforcement mechanism. If I've got a web browser talking to a database backend, maybe I have LDAP implemented so that the SQL user on the web server is the same as the SQL user on the database. Or maybe they operate in different organizational domains, but there's a trust boundary that exists between those two systems, the web server and the database. And we need an authentication mechanism to ensure that one talking to the other knows who's on each side of that boundary.
Okay. And just for our listeners who aren't super familiar with Linux, chmod is related to changing the permissions on a file, saying, Justin could then read the file. But going a little more down this rabbit hole of trust boundaries, how do I actually find them in my diagram? Is there like a secret trick to finding them? Or is it just there's an external user and an internal system, and I don't want to allow the external user to do whatever they want, so there must be a trust boundary between them?
So that's a great place to start. And the trick to finding them is saying, is there any control, or could we put a control between here and there? So as you're looking at, say, a web server, the web server has a set of code that runs inside the web server. There's not really a way to put a boundary between that code and the web server when it's running. The web server might depend on files on disk. So I might run the web server as user Adam and make sure that the files are all owned by Justin and are read-only relative to everyone but Justin. That way, the web server, if someone breaks into it, can't write to those files. So there's a trust boundary there. It's a trust boundary, again, that's enforced by the user ID system, by the Linux kernel. And you can go through and say, could we put a control there? And if you can, then there's a trust boundary that exists. And today, that trust boundary might or might not be enforced, right? It might be that all of the files, the web server runs as Adam, all of the files are owned by Adam. So there's no trust boundary present, or there's no trust boundary that's enforced, but we could install one if we want to add that layer of defense.
So almost the unenforced trust boundary is there's one in my head and I think that there's a separation, but it might not actually be there. Or at least I think there should be a separation.
Well, that's a great question. Here's the thing that happens is you think that trust boundary exists and I don't. And so I write my code such that the web server writes to configuration files, say. You don't think it's there. And so you write all of your configuration to the SQL database. Now we've got a half-enforced trust boundary, right? So all the work that you're doing to put your configuration in a safe place is undercut by the work that I'm doing. When we threat model for the first time, by making it explicit, even if we're making it very lightweight explicit on a whiteboard, we identify these different mental models that people had, and we discover, hey, we could make improvements here, would be way cheaper if I had written my code the same way you did the first time around. And threat modeling helps us do that.
Okay, so by having that almost explicit threat modeling, we're not introducing vulnerabilities by having assumptions that are undocumented and unproven.
Mm-hmm.
So changing gears a little bit, let's discuss specifically how we approach threat modeling. So you discussed in your book the attacker-centric, the asset-centric, and the software-centric approaches. Can you discuss what each of these are and some of the advantages and disadvantages for them?
Sure. And let me start by saying we're going to end with software, which is what you should be doing, and I'll explain why. So attacker-centric modeling is we're going to build personas for the people who are going to attack us and use it to understand how they're going to attack and what they might do. And that's difficult because if you go and talk to usability experts, the way to build personas is to go and engage with the persona in their natural environment, to understand what they do and why. You can't go and talk to ransomware authors as they're doing their work. You can't go and talk to spies as they're doing this work. And so it's hard to create good personas. It's hard to create a complete list of personas. And so this approach is expensive, and it often leads us astray. Similarly, asset-centric threat modeling, what do attackers want? What's the valuable pieces here? Can lead you to miss things. You can be thinking about, oh, this is a list of expired passwords that we don't care about because they're expired. We're keeping them around so people can't change their password back to this. Those are super valuable to attackers who want to use the password, Justin at IEEE.org on some other website to see if they can log in as you because you haven't changed your password. And so asset-centric approaches tend to lead us to miss things. They tend to lead us to things which are out of scope. Oh, I'm just doing a banking web app, but the money is really in the general ledger, so I'm going to focus on that. Nope, we want to focus on what we're working on. And what we're working on is the software, the technology. It's the thing that we as engineers know best. It's the thing that we ought to be able to talk about. And that's why we start from that. When I go and I talk to engineers and I say, what are we working on here? People will jump up at the whiteboard and start drawing pictures. I like to start the threat modeling work from that natural starting point of what people know, what they're comfortable talking about, and what we can scope and understand.
Okay, so essentially, the attacker-centric is all about who's actually going to attack us, and that's almost impossible because that requires you traveling to Nigeria to speak to whoever the Nigerian prince is that's writing the phishing emails. Asset-centric doesn't really work so well because it's all surrounding the crown jewels, and what you might think is the most valuable thing in the world might not actually be what the attackers are going to go after first. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit and then work their way to your crown jewels. And software-centric is all around, what am I actually building? I'm building a banking web app. It's all around money. It's all around transactions. I need to secure this from the outside in, not just the one database where I have the balances for everybody's accounts.
Yes, and also crucially, it's the thing that's inside your control, right? It's the thing that threat modeling can affect when you do it.
Okay, so essentially because I actually control what the software is going to do, how it's going to be architected, how it'll be deployed, I can actually manage that risk versus attacker-centric. I can't control who attacks my application. I can't say, well, we're only going to allow nation states to attack this, not the script kiddie.
It would be great if they obeyed the keep out signs.
Calling all developers. There's no telling what you can create when you upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Are you ready to build the applications you want, however you want them? Are you ready to develop applications faster than ever? Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
So let's just move off the topic of the different approaches to threat modeling and move more into how we're going to find the threats in a model. So I'm actually going to be linking in an article from Software Engineering Institute on 12 different methods for threat modeling. But I wanted to get your opinion. Why are there so many different methods to find threats in a model?
Why are there so many different programming languages? Right? Different methods have different strengths and weaknesses. And as we've developed understanding of how to do things, we've also developed new tools to help us threat model. And so in the same way that it is somewhat unusual today to see code being written in Perl, it is somewhat unusual to see some of the methods listed in that paper in active use, because we've learned as we've gone through the experience of using them. And let me make this concrete. So, for example, attack trees are one of the oldest methods to structure your analysis. And it turns out that really building an attack tree is more structured than just brainstorming and thinking about what can go wrong willy-nilly. But there's not a lot of guidance. The guidance says things like, think about other ways for this to happen. Okay, but if I'm not a security expert, how do I know that I actually have this done well? And so attack trees seem like a good idea, and then in practice you try and use them, and they don't offer the same support and structure that newer methods offer.
So you mentioned newer methods. What would you consider would be newer methods to threat modeling?
So I think the newest method would be the use of a kill chain to ask what could go wrong. And kill chains come from the idea that an attacker has to follow a set of steps in order to break in successfully. They might do some reconnaissance. They might take an exploit and weaponize it. That is to say, package the exploit against a vulnerability into an attractive looking email with an attachment. The user clicks on that and the exploit runs. The exploit takes control of the system and it does an installation step. Then it tries to persist itself. And only then does the attacker have control and are able to execute their initial goal. And by going through and thinking about each of those steps relative to what are we working on, I can say, what are the best delivery points here? If a piece of software installed itself, how would it do that? We talked about immutable builds and Phoenix builds, database versus configuration files. And so you can see that those possibilities get illuminated by the kill chain. And so we can use the kill chain to structure the way we answer what can go wrong.
Yes. So I know in the cybersecurity space, we discuss a lot the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which is, I think, kind of what you're referring to.
It is. I didn't want to go all geeky about the detail and history of the kill chain.
So almost what you're saying is, so that kill chain, I would say, oh, my application accepts file uploads. That would be a great thing to weaponize from an attacker perspective to execute files on my system.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay. And then moving over a little bit, I know that you mainly worked with Stride in your previous work. Can you discuss a little bit what Stride is, what it stands for, and how to use it?
Sure. So Stride is the first really structured approach to threat modeling. It's a model of what can go wrong. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, which is to say denying that something happened or that you're not responsible for it, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And so you can use Stride as a checklist as you think through each piece of your diagram, each piece of software you're working on. You could say, how could someone spoof themselves to this, pretend to be someone else? How could someone tamper with it or modify it without my authorization, etc., etc.? And so you can use Stride as a structured analytic technique, and it's actually the first of what I think of as the structured analytic techniques. And you mentioned that I've talked a lot about Stride over the years. It's true. Let me credit here the authors, Lauren Karnfelder and Prerit Garg, and say that they really opened my eyes to the possibility of structuring our work. And for a long time, I confused that possibility with the way to achieve it. And as time has gone by, I've really seen that we can alternate structures, that we can use Stride or the kill chain or something else. We could use an attack tree to structure our thinking. And we can interchange componentry, right? In the same way that I started answering this question by talking about multiple programming languages, we can use different tools to achieve the same goal. And that's incredibly important as we think about How do we engage with threat modeling as a discipline, as a research topic, and as an opportunity to make more secure systems?
So threat modeling is almost an overall concept that you can take these different tools and plug them in. And by swapping out different pieces and putting in different tools, we can actually get different outcomes and benefits and discoveries of new things that we wouldn't have detected. I.e., we might have used Stride before, and then we used Kill Chain, and all of a sudden we detected that there was something we didn't even think about with Stride.
Absolutely. And it's a trap to say threat modeling is, or the way to threat model is. You can say the way we should threat model this particular thing today is this, but we have a toolbox, and we need to conceive of threat modeling as a toolbox, not as a single way of doing things.
So, what actually affects the usefulness of these different methods? Do you focus in on someone's experience threat modeling, what kinds of diagrams you have for the software, what kind of software or application it is, whether it's cloud-based, on-prem, a software as a service, a kernel?
All of this, all of the context in which the work is done influences how we do the work. So, for example, if I'm threat modeling a mobile app, maybe a state machine is more useful than a data flow diagram, right? My data flow diagram is the mobile app talks to the bank, and hopefully not, but probably it talks to a bunch of advertising servers and tracking services, etc. And the questions that I'm going to ask are all, what are the state transitions? How do I move from not logged in to logged in? How do I move from the see my balance screen to the transfer money screen? And do I need a secondary authentication there in some way? And so, in that case, what we're working on influences the form in which we think about what we're working on, from a data flow diagram to a state machine to swim lanes and message flow diagrams. And similarly, we can pick and choose between the tools for what can go wrong.
Okay, so I imagine after we go through all these different threat modeling methods and maybe we pick 3 of them and generate a whole big giant list of threats, how do I actually filter this down to say, these are the threats that I need to care about?
So there's a couple of things that you can do. The first is easy fixes first, right? Fix your S3 buckets, please. Fix your cloud data stores. We don't need to do a should we worry about it exercise on that. The time we need to do the exercise of should we worry about this or should we take action on this is only once we know that the fixes are complicated, that this would be hard to fix now. But also, we need to put this knowledge into our backlog. We need to document the knowledge. And this is closer to standard software engineering than it is to threat modeling. And so it's a boundary step in a sense, where we learn that this stuff can go wrong. I've got a bunch of things that are easy to make changes to. I'm going to put those in, and I'm going to treat the rest as part of my backlog. And one of the things that people often say, and this might be a good time to bring it up, is what's the relationship between risk and threat modeling? And to me, threat modeling is where we find the things on which we can do the risk analysis later. And sometimes that risk analysis is important, and sometimes it's just easier to take action.
Okay, so essentially, don't just discount something because you think it's ridiculous. I'm a small bank, and I don't think that China's going to try to hack into my mobile app that only has 5 users. While that might be realistic from a risk perspective, that your risk of a nation state attacker using certain exploits against your system that you're not going to be able to defend against is minimal, you shouldn't just throw it away and pretend like it doesn't exist.
Yes, right? If you're going to, let's say you are a bank, you have a risk register, you have a list, and whenever we deal with risk, there are 4 steps we can take. We can accept risk, we can transfer it, we can mitigate it, and we can eliminate it. And mature risk management does not involve the developer saying, I don't know what to do about a nation state, so I'm going to ignore it. Ignore was not on my list of 4, right? Accept was. And maybe accept is a reasonable thing. And then we want to say, who can accept the risk? How is that tracked? How much risk have they accepted? And is that risk appropriate for their seniority within the organization, for the organization as a whole?
So, for example, a junior developer probably shouldn't be accepting a risk that, oh, there's a SQL injection that might dump our whole customer database, whereas the CEO accepting that risk is completely different.
Yes, exactly. And so this is why it goes into the backlog. And this gets to, we talked earlier about we need to write it down, we need to have a record that we did this work. And so a lot of times this stuff can be tracked in standard bugs, right? The risks to my software system, maybe if it's a security one severity item, only a VP can close that bug. And the VP has to log into Jira and close the bug and say, I accept this risk. And there's a technique that I've become really fond of, which is bug bars that encapsulate what the severity is, who's allowed to make decisions about it. And that's much more. And the only thing we think about is what is the impact of this bug? And it simplifies the whole discussion. A lot of times we get into these very convoluted arguments. We get into these systems where we try and put numbers on these things which are unique to threat modeling, when really they need to be processed with all of the other risks, right? What is the risk that my database will leak versus what is the risk, as we're recording this on March 20th. I hope you don't mind me saying that. We have the COVID virus. There's a lot of questions. What does this mean to my organization? Can I get work done? Maybe today the risk that someone will steal our database is acceptable relative to the risk that our customers can't log in. But boy, next week I want to come back to that risk. And we want to make those decisions in the way that's right for our organizations.
Exactly. So essentially, treat these threats that we're finding as bugs and assign some level of risk to them and track them in your bug tracking system. That way, your developers are kept in the loop on what's expected of them. It's all done in the same place. Your projects are managed in that same system, however you approach that management. And then by having that risk awareness and that understanding that, maybe while my whole workforce is remote, giving everyone VPN is okay. But 6 months from now, when they're all back on site, maybe everyone doesn't need to have VPN access, that we might want to revisit all of these bugs.
Yes, absolutely.
So just changing gears a little bit here, I want to discuss privacy and threat modeling. So I know that's been a hot topic recently. How can I leverage threat modeling to discover possible privacy issues?
So there are a number of collections of privacy threats that we can think about. The one that I see under the most active development is called Lindun. And I'm not going to attempt to rattle off what Lindun stands for, but it's a very privacy-centric collection. There are other collections which are, and Lindun is focused on things like unobservability and unlinkability. And these are privacy-centric topics where we avoid linkability between entities because then all sorts of harms can't come to pass. There are other approaches, like looking at Dan Solov's list of harms, which are much more outcome focused. And again, every time you threat model, it's what are the tools I'm pulling from my toolbox? As you develop a more mature privacy practice, and a lot of companies are getting here now because of GDPR, because of CCPA, there's a list of problems that you want to avoid. You can treat that not as a compliance exercise, but as an engineering exercise. How do we avoid this negative outcome? How do we address the need for forgettability or data access and integrate that into your development process so that you're achieving these goals in a balanced way with all of the other things which you need to do to have a successful product? Treating it as something that you bolt on at the end leads to more expensive, more difficult decisions than if you think about it up front.
Okay, and just for our listeners, Linda stands for linkability, identifiability, non-repudiation, detectability, disclosure of information, content unawareness, policy, and consent non-compliance. I will definitely put a link in the show notes for that because that is a mouthful. But just kind of delving a little more into what you said. So, should I actually track these privacy threats that I'm detecting as part of my threat modeling process with my security threats? Should I do it the exact same way? Is there a special way I should be doing it that's different? Should these not go in my bug tracker?
I think every time we add this is special and different, we increase the risk that people will get confused. We increase the training requirements. We increase the task switching requirement. I think all of those are negative. And as we think about what engineering processes ought to be like, those are things we want to avoid. And these are things that other parts of the company often cares about. And so, what is the right balance for your organization? When I worked at Microsoft, we had pretty technically savvy lawyers. Telling a lawyer that they should look at a bug database, I'm not going to say that was reasonable and expected, but it wouldn't have been like having three arms, right? It would be something that I think I could have discussed. And I work with a lot of clients in a lot of different places. And the idea that a lawyer would use the bug tracker and look at things is inconceivable.
Exactly. So essentially, you need to articulate it and present it in a format that the people that care about these privacy issues are able to understand it. So lawyers who are worried about your legal compliance with a privacy regulation need to be able to understand, yes, these are the privacy threats we've seen. This is how we're addressing them in a maybe not necessarily technical manner, but a way that they could go into the courtroom and argue, we're doing something about this, we promise.
Yep. And maybe I have a project manager craft a report for them once a week. Maybe it's a different process, but it depends on your organization, the way you answer the question, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and making that as lightweight as you can, right? More energy on the doing, the analysis, the fixing than on the documentation. We don't want documentation is there to serve a purpose. The agile world loves the phrase, you ain't gonna need it. So let's apply that to threat modeling and create only the things we need. Ask for what we really need rather than, oh, we need a report like this or a report like that because Adam talked about it in his book. Please don't ever say that.
Exactly. So only worry about what you actually are going to need as a demand is put in place for it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just dive a little more in on that risk management discussion we were having earlier. Just as a follow-up, do you recommend doing a formal risk management with like a quantitative or a qualitative technique, or more of an ad hoc risk management? I think you had kind of touched on that answer before, but I just wanted to dive into it and make it explicit.
Yes, as not your lawyer, I'm not here to advise on risk per se. The the approach that I find to be most aligned with engineering at most organizations I work with are bug bars, where we say this severity of impact leads to this level of person making a decision about this. Because the ability to think about risk is usually correlated with seniority, right? The VP of engineering or the CEO makes a decision about all the bank's data going out. We as engineers don't make that call. And when we conflate threats and risks, which is really easy using English as an informal, unstructured language. It's easy to go back and forth, and I caught myself doing it once earlier in this podcast. But thinking about threat modeling as an engineering discipline that's designed to produce problems to be addressed is what I see leading to the most success.
Okay. So, and diving in a little earlier, you mentioned the 4 ways to actually manage your threats: mitigate, accept, transfer. How do I track these threats that I'm accepting? And how do I communicate them to the customer?
So, so actually, it's funny that you said it that way. I don't know if this was intentional, but you said threats and I said risk. It's classic risk management to accept, mitigate, transfer, or eliminate. And what you need to do is to have some form of communications to the customer saying, we expect you to make a decision about this. So, for example, opening files can be risky. So we warn people, and then they get used to those warnings and they fail to even see that they're there. The Java license historically has said you may not use Java in nuclear power plant control, right? So that's one way to say that is you put it in the license. Another way to do this is to write a deployment guide or a security guide for your customers that says, hey, if you're deploying our product, we expect that it will be behind a firewall. I was talking to some people who make very, very big lab equipment, the sort of lab equipment that sells for $1 million or so. And this lab equipment has, I don't have a number, call it 50 PCs incorporated into it in various ways. And then it has a gateway that's actually built into it. And their deployment manual says, we have a lot of old, crufty technology in the guts of this thing. I don't think those are the precise words, but that's what it says. Do not enable IP routing between the innards of this system and anything else. You will hurt yourself. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable outcome of a threat model, right? Those 50 PCs that are doing data acquisition, some of them have some very low level code that's written to pull data off of serial ports very, very quickly. And it's harder and harder to write that code on a modern operating system because the operating system saying, no, you can't sit in the kernel and do that. No one needs to do that. And so some of these systems are old and outdated, but they put that into a security ops guide, which is a way to loop back to your question, is a way to tell the customer, this is what we expect. This is what we learned threat modeling, formally or informally, right? In the case of those old PCs, they knew about that problem. They didn't need to write a threat model to get there. But the output of your threat model sometimes does go to the customer and say, do this, not that.
Okay, so I think traditionally in almost the PCI retail realm, you have a point of sale application. And as part of that, there's a deployment guide that says this is how you deploy this to be PCI DSS compliant. And here are all the threats that we identified. And these are all the switches that you need to flip if you don't want to have a really bad day with your point of sale system and fail all your audits. So that's the same almost as your discussion of communicating with the customer. We have this old technology built into our system. We can't change it. Please don't put it on the internet. It's going to end very, very badly for you.
Exactly.
So switching gears a little bit, what if we choose to mitigate that risk? How should I actually test my software to make sure it really is mitigated?
So when we say mitigate, what we really mean is to install controls, right? I'm going to make the operating system immutable, and I am taking a dependency on that. So there, what we want to do is we want to write tests. We want to see, can I write a file? Can I change the configuration of immutability from userland? What happens if I attempt to write a file? And if I have a test, right, this is a standard test-driven development, unit testing. If I have a test that tries to write a file, and then 4 lines later in that test code, it tries to read from that file, and if it ever succeeds, it pops a Sev1 bug and breaks the build, then that's good. Maybe what I want is operational controls. I don't want to run that as a test in my build pipeline. I want to write it as almost like an assertion, whereas if the assertion is ever violated, I segfault. I have an operational test that attempts to write a file every 3 minutes, right? Put in a cron job or something. And if the cron job ever succeeds, I know that there's an operational problem, and I should image that machine right now and take it out of the pool of active servers. And so this is very similar to the test work that people are doing in agile shops today. A fellow that I worked with at Microsoft said threat modeling is just test planning and test design. And while I think that's a little bit extreme, there's a great overlap between the test mindset and asking what can go wrong, right? Do we account for all of these weird conditions that we could encounter, and the way in which we threat model and think about security?
So essentially, the tests are there to test for the fact that our assumption is actually true, that this control to that there should never be any network connectivity outbound on an unestablished connection because that's associated with malware. So we're going to try to establish a connection to an internet site somewhere, Google DNS or what have you. If that happens and succeeds, then we should immediately fail the system, and that's a broken test. So then my follow-up is, so then would these live with your functional requirement test suite, or should this be in its own special tests group for security tests only?
The more threat modeling influences mainline development, the happier I am. And let me just say on the what to reach out to, a lot of companies have a server now sitting in the cloud called Break Glass. And the test is all of my machine information, and I connect to it. And anytime Break Glass gets a connection that has the silly little password so it doesn't get found by Nmap scanning and stuff, it breaks the glass. The place that testing for security starts to look a little different is when you're doing penetration testing. If the way I'm going to address SQL injection is not prepared statements, then I need to have a whole suite of specially designed SQL injection tests that are going to find these sorts of problems. Much better to detect it early and say, we're not going to do dynamic SQL. We're going to do prepared statements so that the architecture manages this threat. But if you do, you need specialized tests. Ideally, those are in the mainline test suite. Sometimes they'll also be broken out and tagged security in some fashion so you can run security-specific tests.
Okay. And then with these tests and all these test cases, who should actually be writing them? Should it be the security team, a special person on the security team, developers, quality assurance, QA? Who should be doing this?
Who writes your tests?
So essentially, it should be the same person that's writing your tests right now for your test-driven development.
Yes. And sometimes that person is going to get support from a security champ, a specialist on the security team. But the more we can infuse, look, over the last decade or so, reliability has become a mainstream concern of software development. Used to be we had a reliability and scaling specialist function. And at a lot of places, there are still specialists who can help with that. And we expect our developers to write reliable code, right? They need to come into the room with an understanding that their code is going to be reliable. And oh, by the way, I've got this weird issue that I don't know how to address. Mr. Expert, Ms. Expert, can you help me figure out what to do in this scenario? But mainline, it is mainline. It's the responsibility of the person who's building the system.
Okay, so at the end of the day, the developer is responsible for actually making sure that these things are put in place because they're writing the code. Therefore, they should own the code that they're putting out there.
Developers.
So switching gears a little bit here, let's move into some of the tooling to keep track of the overall threat modeling process. Is there any tooling that you would specifically recommend? A formal tooling, Excel spreadsheets, a whiteboard, a notepad, a legal pad for the lawyers?
So I love threat modeling on a whiteboard. I think it is the place where we get the most organic, highest value. And as you get into doing this organizationally, security teams often want structured data that they can run analysis on, they can run comparisons on, they want views into that this work is being done, they want the work to be recorded in some way. So there's an OWASP tool called Threat Dragon. They just released version 1. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of potential there. I'm on the advisory board of a company called Continuum, who have a system for doing threat modeling across hundreds of projects at scale. As you start out, I don't want you to start by selecting a tool. I want you to start out by answering 4 questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? Did we do a good job? Document that however works for you. Over time, requirements for the software that you use will come from where are the pain points in actually doing this work. What is the software going to do for me? Gets you to a much crisper answer than saying, what can software do for threat modeling? Right? Do I go with Threat Dragon? Do I go with Continuum? You're not going to know the answer until you've done this a bunch of times so that you know how it's going to work for you, how it integrates into your process and delivers results for you. And then you can say, how do we make this more efficient? How do we make this more measurable? How do we improve the analysis that we're performing? All of those software will help you with as you develop maturity and skills in threat modeling.
Exactly. So it's almost that you ain't going to need it concept. Don't start by picking the tool out. Shelf that concept for now. Just do the threat modeling. And then as you start to get asked by stakeholders for, well, how many threats do you discover when you take a new application in? How long does it take on average to put these bugs into the system before they're assigned to a developer, and then a developer actually implements the fix and risk management is involved, or whatever metrics you want to track against it? That's when you need to actually start picking your tools and almost have that feature set that you're looking for based on those requirements.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So just moving a little bit back towards the start of the episode, we kind of discussed why threat modeling is important. So now I kind of want to discuss, how do I take that threat model and why it's important and sell it to my organization? How do I sell it to my managers to say, I need time to work on threat modeling this piece of software that we're rolling out in 6 months?
Wow, we could do a whole episode on this. Let me start with the structured approach to security and the increased collaboration between security and development. Let me continue with getting everyone at a whiteboard discussing architecture reduces rework. If you get no security benefit whatsoever, and I've never seen that happen, from getting all the people involved in a system in a room, drawing the system on a whiteboard and arguing about how it works, right? There's benefit right there. And that benefit has payoff in lower rework, right? It's not even a security benefit, but it gets you into the threat modeling process. Another thing that often comes up is, I'm tired of seeing the same pen test results on every system. How do we get security earlier? How do we get this moving in a way that's less difficult for us? So those are all ways that help organizations get started. And I'll plug a talk I did at OWASP AppSec California 2019 conference. Put a link in the show notes, but it's entitled A Seat at the Table. It's 30 minutes on exactly this question.
Awesome. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, definitely. And I'll also put links to those tools that you mentioned, Continuum and the OWASP Threat Dragon. But I know as a community, we generally like anecdotal stories to be able to, explain to management, well, here's how this helped this specific group. Can you give us an example of a project where threat modeling actually discovered some type of severe vulnerability that you would have broken a build over if you had known about it?
So this is one of those questions that's really tricky, because for all of the good problems that we find in threat modeling, many of them get fixed, and so the problem never materializes. Many of the others, nobody wants to admit they knew that could happen and decided it was too difficult to fix. And so I have to go back a little ways to come to a problem that's really visible. And for that, I'm going to talk about the Zotob worm. And the Zotob worm was one of these fast spreading worms in the early 2000s that really killed Windows 2000 and was less bad against Windows 2003. And the reason it was less bad in 2003 was because it had been discovered threat modeling. The fix was really complicated. And so they put some mitigations into 2003 that reduced the impact. And when the bug was externally discovered, there was no way to backport the fixes to Windows 2000. So it was really severely impacted. And I mention this in part because Microsoft talks about this. There's a fellow, Bob Fruth, who's talked about it a lot. He was in the room when it happened. And so that's an example of threat modeling actually dramatically, to use today's terminology, flattening the curve of malware installation because of threat modeling. But a lot of the great proof points that I have are great in the context of, boy, are we glad we didn't ship that. And so I want to encourage people to pilot, to go answer those 4 questions quickly, and to use the discoveries that they're making as evidence for the organization to adopt the practice. The bug in your code is way more interesting than the bug in anyone else's code.
Exactly. So essentially sell to management on the basis that, look, even if this gives us no security benefit, we at least will reduce rework. We'll all be on the same page. And by the way, most likely we're going to find something really, really bad, and you're all going to be very happy that we did this.
Yes. And getting started, 5 minutes of drawing on a whiteboard, using the elevation of privilege card deck, which we haven't talked about, but let me talk about real briefly. And I want people to suspend their disbelief for a minute. Elevation of Privilege is a card game that helps people threat model. And so it has cards, and I'm just grabbing a copy here. It has cards like the 6 of Tampering. An attacker can write to a data store your code relies on. So you draw a picture on the whiteboard. We say, hey, what does this web server rely on? Here are some configuration files. And by the way, I did not plan for the card I opened to be a threat that we had discussed already on the show. That was a random little bit. But the game, it's freely downloadable. And we'll put a link in the show notes. It's available for sale on Amazon. It was designed as the easy way to get started threat modeling. You can get started and get results inside of an hour. I encourage you to do so.
Okay. And where would that fit in? Is that between the diagramming process and, let's start using Stride? Is that where that card game would start to get used?
So the whiteboard diagram is, what are we working on? The card game is built around Stride. Stride is a backbone for the game. You don't need to know much about Stride to use it. And so it's a way of answering what are we working on and what can go wrong. And because of the gamified nature of it, because of the hints on the cards, because the game gives people social permission to be a little bit silly at work, it encourages this free flow of ideas, perspectives. And so I have never run a session where people have sat down with the cards and not gotten engaged inside of about 10 minutes. And I'm very hands off. You don't need me in the room.
Exactly. So I'll definitely put a link to the show notes for the card deck. And I believe there's instructions that come with that as well for how to run the game.
There are, yes.
Awesome. So one last kind of topic switch here before we start to wrap up. The threat modeling of new software. Does it change at all for, web API driven software, the Internet of Things, or whatever the latest term for that concept of embedded systems everywhere is, or, containerized services running Docker or some other Kubernetes cluster executing Docker under the hood?
Yes, it does change, right? The answer to what are we working on, the answers to what can go wrong, the answers to what are we going to do about it are different in each of these. For example, in IoT, there's often a concern about if people change the passwords, how do they get back into the device? And so you have to think about that. The thing that remains the same across all of these is the four question framework. And there's a trap in what you're asking, which is totally natural. People say, how do I threat model this particular thing? Just get started. Dive in and threat model. Do an analysis. Don't worry about the specifics. I mean, when I say don't worry about the specifics, don't worry about the specifics of what you're threat modeling and the way that threat modeling affects microservices or web-driven APIs. Build a threat model. As you develop skill, you will realize that the threats to the web API tend to be like this. The threats to IoT tend to be like this. But if I were to try to give advice for each of these specific things, right, how do we apply the four questions in this specific thing that I'm working on? We end up with this explosion of variance, right? How do I threat model Lambda services written in Go that are offering web APIs? Okay, it's a valid question. We threat model it with the four questions, and the way we answer what can go wrong and what are we going to do about it is different in that scenario than it is if my web API is written in, I don't know, Perl. Right? A lot more is going to go wrong with Perl, frankly. And I say that as a fan of the language, but we've learned a lot since it was created.
Exactly. So really don't worry about what technology you're implementing this with. Just do the actual threat modeling. And while you may not have as many, specific types of threats with a web API, an IoT device, on the other hand, you're going to be worried a lot about physical access threats, whereas your web API sitting in AWS, probably not as much about some type of physical mechanism that you're going to attack it with.
Yes. And when we're talking about IoT and physical access, people often say, "Oh, that's in the home, it's no big deal." Think about people who use Airbnb, people who install this in their store or other open area. Think about the house cleaner. And so there's often a desire to scope this and say, "Oh, it's in someone's home, it's an IoT device, it's safe." When you think about what can go wrong with a little bit more structure, you realize that there are answers to that question which don't let you dismiss this and say all the threats are necessarily out of scope. Or maybe you put a label on the box that says not appropriate for Airbnb rented properties, right? A little bit of a warning label going back to your question about what do we tell the end user? What do we tell the buyer?
Exactly. I have to stick the label on the box that says, do not allow unfettered physical access to this device as it may result in negative consequences for you. Or from the company perspective, take my threat model and say, you know what, even the end consumer, I'm going to assume might be evil because this is eventually connecting to my API in the back end. So from that perspective, they're an external entity. The whole device is an external entity connecting to my API. So my trust boundary is between my API and the device.
Yes, trusting a device that sits in the hands of an end user for extended periods of time is, well, let me just say that when I do attack work, it's a lot of fun.
So I just want to kind of close out the episode a little bit here. Is there anything that I missed that you think developers and software engineers should know?
I think that the biggest thing I want to emphasize is that threat modeling is a big collection of techniques that can look very intimidating when you get started. There are four simple questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? If you ask those questions, if you treat the last question, did we do a good job, as not just a mechanical question of did we find some threats, do we have a diagram, but also as an opportunity to do retrospectives as you're starting this work to say what went well, what went poorly, what do we keep, what do we change. And in fact, I tell people to start out with a 1-to-1 ratio of time spent threat modeling and time doing retrospectives. That falls off very quickly, but that early listening really helps organizations start to threat model and do it in a way that brings them value.
Fantastic. And then are you doing any further in-depth research on the topic of threat modeling?
I am. So I've been thinking a lot about conflict, about abuse of user-generated content, trolling, deepfakes, abuse that happens online. And so I've been thinking about that. I'm talking to a team at Oxford University who's bringing the techniques of threat modeling to intimate partner violence. How do we use these techniques to shed a light on the way in which technology intersects with that form of abuse and the unique ways that it happens? I'm doing research into can we create additional taxonomies around things like fraud that more and more organizations are using. And I'm also keeping my eyes on things like machine learning. What is new and different about threat modeling in IoT? And to me, these are fascinating questions. These are, how do we build new tools in that toolbox? But we can achieve good value without those tools. We'll achieve more value with them.
That's fantastic. And where can listeners follow your research and all these things that you're, trying to push out into the community to increase knowledge on threat modeling?
So the best way is adam.shostack.org/blog. And I try and keep that a little more focused than an old school blog. I try for posts that are on topic, that are a little bit more in depth. So that would be the number one place to go. There's also, I want to mention a great resource. The OWASP Slack community has a really active threat modeling channel. We've got about 1,000 people in it. We have lots of interesting discussions, ranging from the very broad to the very specific. So join in, and it's a great way to meet other people who are struggling with similar problems to what you have.
That's fantastic. I'll definitely put links to both of those in the show notes. That way it's easier for people to find. So, Adam, I just want to close out the episode and thank you for coming on the show to discuss threat modeling techniques and how we can apply them to our software development processes.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
This is Justin Beyer for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform, the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.